Chapter 8 Double Death. May I come in? Asked Harold, as he knocked at the door of the Hibbard home. George Hibbard looked up from his reading rack as the young boy quietly entered the huge, gaily pampered, and book-filled room overlooking Harney Valley. Why, hello there, Harold. Of course you may. I'm glad to see you again. When did you return to Burns? I suppose that you've come back to spend another summer vacation with your Uncle Robert's at your Uncle Robert's home. Yes, nodded the visitor. I had such a good time last summer after I met you that I begged Dad and Mother to let me come back to Burns for a few weeks this summer. Auntie had already written and invited me. She said you wouldn't be going away until October. I was afraid you might be visiting Roberta or Hazel or Frances or Virginia. You're certainly lucky. That's one advantage I don't have. 6 brothers and sisters to go and see. Don't forget to count me, smiled George's sister, Eugenia, as she came from the kitchen and shook hands with Harold. But, of course, George isn't visiting when he's here with us. This is our old family home. Dad built this when he first came here as a young dentist. If you're going to talk a while, I'll run next door on an errand. You can telephone there if you need me, she said as she left the room. Oh, I'd like to stay if I'm not interrupting any plans, Harold answered quickly. All winter I've been looking forward to our next visit. I've told so many people about your interesting nature stories that almost all the youngsters I know have heard them over and over. It's time to learn some new ones. The story I want to hear the most of all is the one that you and Eugenia mentioned last fall, the one about your father's fishing trip. Well, chuckled the paralyzed librarian, Dad went on dozens of fishing trips, both alone and with us. But I believe I know which trip you mean. Of course, I was too small to go, but I've heard Dad and Eugenia tell the story so many times that it seems as though I actually saw the whole thing. Oh, good, breathed Mr. Hibbard's young guest. You're going to tell me the story now. That's right, said George. But before you take my reading rack off the bed, please bring over that new book. There, that's the one. Dittmer's Snakes of the World. Now turn over to there it is. Aren't those wonderful pictures? He smiled at Harold's quick gasp. I thought perhaps you'd like to check out this book to read. You've always seemed specially interested in snake stories. However, when I finish my hair-raising account, perhaps you won't want anything more on that subject. And now, if you'll take away both the book and the reading rack, I'll begin the story. Harold leaned back in the comfortable armchair near the bedside and looked closely at the keen brown face on the white pillow. Even when Eugenia was small, she always begged to go along with Dad on his trips. Sometimes he took several of us, but sometimes when he and his portable dental chair traveled the many long miles down to the south end of the country, he took Roberta, his oldest child. However, on this trip to the historic White Horse Ranch, he took Llewellyn and Eugenia. They traveled by car. Dad really didn't expect to be away many days. Usually he took along camping equipment, but since this was mainly a business trip, he just had several blankets on the back seat of the car. The cook at the White Horse Ranch packed a big lunch for the 3 of them, but they stopped at noon to fish for a while. They walked far enough to work up a real appetite, and by the time they stopped eating, not only the noon lunch, but also the evening food supply was gone. Well, we did justice to that good food, laughed Dad, wiping his mustache and beard. We won't worry, though. In a few hours' time, we'll reach a stopover where we can get food and a night's lodging. Hadn't we better start? Questioned. Well, this Ford hasn't been running just right. We might break down out in the Alberts Desert. I'm not anxious to do that. Yes, Dad, let's go, added Eugenia. I wanted to do some more fishing farther along the way. I haven't had a bit of luck today. Dad shook his head as he gathered up the empty lunch basket and got ready to start the car. I'm afraid we won't have time for that, dear. Some other time, perhaps. Eugenia didn't say another word until they neared a brushy creek. It seemed to be an ideal place for fine mountain trout. She felt that she couldn't bear to pass by and not try her luck just once. Please, Dad, let's just stop for a few minutes. I'm sure that stream is full of trout. I want to catch one and take it home to show Mother. Oh, please, Dad, do stop. And did they? Harold blurted out. He leaned forward as he eagerly waited for George's answer. Yes, they stopped, nodded George. Dad squinted at the sun to see what time it was. He had a watch, of course, but he lived outdoors so much that he could read nature's signals as easily as those made by men. All right, Eugenia, he agreed. We'll fish here for exactly 30 minutes. At the end of that time, we're going on toward Burns, fish or no fish. So make good use of this half hour. Thanks, Dad, Eugenia said. You both go on down to the creek, and if you want to, I'll be there in a few minutes. By the time she got out her pole and fishing tackle, the two were out of sight. As she walked toward the small stream, she saw that its banks were thickly covered with brush and river willows. I think I can make better time by walking up this little hill and jumping down near the creek bank, Eugenia muttered to herself. It'll take too long to push myself through all those branches. If I don't hurry, I won't have any time left. How big was the hill? Questioned Harold. About like this one, where your house is built? Oh, no, answered George. It was only what might be called a steep bank, probably a little higher than Eugenia's head. But it was steep enough so that when she jumped from its top down into the narrow space below, she couldn't return by that route. The only open path led to the nearby creek. Eugenia glanced hastily downward and then quickly jumped. The fall jarred her a little. She leaned back against the bank while she caught her breath. It was then that she heard the whirling noise of Dad's fishing reel as it unwound. Did you catch one? She asked. She called excitedly. Hold him. I'll be there in a minute. She took one step forward and then stopped, froze in her tracks. Again she heard a whirling sound, but now it came from two directions at once. For the first time since she stood on the little hilltop, Eugenia really looked closely at the ground in front of her, and what she saw caused her heart to skip a beat. There, almost within striking distance, coiled not one, but two huge, hideous rattlesnakes. They blocked her path to safety. Their horny rattles buzzed warningly. Their poisonous heads reared several feet from the ground. Their beady eyes stared unwinkingly at poor Eugenia. Oh, gasped Harold, shuddering. What did she do? Well, continued George, she did just what almost anyone would have done, I guess. She screamed. She screamed with all her might. Hold still, I'm coming, yelled Dad. He knew in an instant what had happened. Don't move. Whatever you do, don't move, he shouted. He crashed through the brush as rapidly as possible. He had no weapon of any sort, for he had left his gun in the car, and her sister, who had the revolver, was farther downstream. He grabbed two pieces of broken willow branches. With these he rushed toward the snakes, which had by now moved even closer to Eugenia. "Oh, Dad!" she cried. She was almost ready to faint. "Don't move," he again warned. He slashed fiercely at first one and then the other of the ugly reptiles. And did he kill them?" half whispered Harold through dry lips. "Not for some time." Dad said it was really the most unusual thing he had ever seen. Usually a rattlesnake will avoid a battle whenever possible, and only rarely will they attack first. But those snakes actually fought Dad. He said that they surely must have been returning to a den in the cliff where they had their young ones. At last Dad managed to beat down their venomous bodies. At last their gray coils lay flattened in the dust. By this time her sister had heard Eugenia's screams. He ran to the spot, then he used his revolver on the two rattlesnakes just to make sure that none of them would be harmed by the double death. When all the excitement was over, Eugenia sank to the ground. Her legs were too weak to hold her up. By that time it was late in the afternoon, so they decided to stay there for the night. Dad and Wanda decided to fish a while longer, but Eugenia wanted to go to the car. They walked to the Ford with her and left her sitting there, high and safe, on the car seat. She said she'd had all the fishing and all the snakes she wanted for some time to come. "Whew," said Harold. "That certainly was an exciting story. I thank you ever so much for telling it to me." He rose and smiled down at George. "But I hear your sister in the kitchen, and now I'd better run home. I have to go downtown for my aunt. I'll be back tomorrow to see you. I'll take this book along, but I don't think I'll read it just yet. I'm like Eugenia. I've had enough snakes for one day."